The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, just as Sarah was making Emma's favorite lunch, peanut butter and banana sandwiches cut into dinosaur shapes. The moment she saw the official seal from the courthouse, her stomach dropped. She recognized the handwriting immediately, her ex-husband Michael's meticulous script on the address label. Sarah set down the butter knife slowly, her hands already beginning to tremble. Emma was at preschool, which meant she had exactly 2 hours before pickup, and whatever was in this envelope couldn't be good. With shaking fingers, Sarah tore it open. The words blurred at first, swimming before her eyes like dark fish in murky water. Petition for modification of custody agreement. Unsafe living conditions. Dangerous animal present in the home. She read the paragraphs once, then again, unable to process what she was seeing. Michael was filing for full custody. He was claiming that Bailey, gentle, loving Bailey, the golden retriever who had saved her life, was a threat to their daughter. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, the document trembling in her hands. Through the window above the sink, she could see Bailey lying in the backyard, peacefully sunbathing in the afternoon light. The dog had no idea her entire world was about to be turned upside down. Bailey couldn't comprehend that somewhere, in some cold legal office, a man was orchestrating the removal of the one being she loved most in the world. The past 2 years flashed through Sarah's mind like a horror film on fast forward. The divorce had been brutal, not because of dramatic fights or infidelity scandals, but because it had revealed something terrifying. Sarah didn't know how to be alone. Michael had controlled most aspects of their life together, and when he left for his yoga instructor girlfriend, 15 years his junior, Sarah had simply broken. The first few months were manageable. Sadness, anger, the usual emotions associated with betrayal. But then came the depression, a suffocating, all-consuming darkness that swallowed her whole. She remembered the mornings she couldn't get out of bed. Emma would wake up, confused and hungry, and 5-year-old Sarah would lie there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if her daughter would be better off without her. She remembered calling in sick to work so many times that her employer finally let her go. She remembered sitting on the bathroom tile floor at 3 a.m., holding a bottle of pills in one hand, a photograph of Emma in the other, genuinely unsure which path to take. The medications her psychiatrist prescribed made her feel numb, disconnected, like she was watching her life through thick glass. Therapy helped, but only incrementally. The darkness was too deep, too pervasive. Then came the day that changed everything. Sarah had volunteered at the local animal shelter, desperate for any distraction from her spiraling thoughts. That's where she met Bailey, a 3-year-old golden retriever with matted fur and sad, haunted eyes. The shelter volunteer explained that Bailey had been rescued from a hoarding situation, traumatized and withdrawn. The dog had been there for 6 months, passed over by every family. Something about Bailey's brokenness mirrored Sarah's own, and without thinking it through, Sarah took her home. The transformation was miraculous. Within days, Bailey began sensing Sarah's panic attacks before they happened. The dog would press her warm body against Sarah's chest, grounding her in the present moment when her mind spiraled into darkness. Bailey forced routine into her life, walks at dawn, playtime in the afternoon, bedtime cuddles. The dog's unconditional love created a reason to get up in the morning. And then something profound occurred. As Sarah healed Bailey's trauma, Bailey healed hers. Emma adored the dog immediately. Sarah had worried about introducing a rescue dog with unknown history to her young daughter, but Bailey was infinitely patient with Emma. The dog would let Emma climb on her back, pull her ears, and nestle into her fur without so much as a growl. More importantly, Bailey became Emma's emotional anchor too. On days when Emma asked for her daddy and cried herself to sleep, Bailey would lie beside her, a silent guardian through the night. Now staring at the legal documents spread across her kitchen table, Sarah felt the old darkness creeping back in. The papers were signed by Robert Mitchell, Michael's attorney, a shark of a man Sarah recognized from her divorce proceedings. The document outlined their concerns with clinical precision: unstable mental health history, excessive reliance on animal for emotional regulation, unknown rescue dog with aggressive potential, unsafe environment for a child. Aggressive potential? Sarah wanted to laugh hysterically. Bailey had never shown even the slightest sign of aggression. The dog's biggest crime was loving too much, being too gentle, too forgiving. But she knew how these things worked. In the hands of skilled lawyers and biased experts, anything could be twisted into a weapon. Sarah's phone rang, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the documents. It was her attorney, James, whom she'd hired after the initial divorce. His voice was serious and carefully measured. "Sarah, I assume you've received the petition." "How did you?" Sarah started. My office got a copy this morning. I wanted to call you before you saw it, but I'm glad you're already aware. We need to meet. This is serious. Serious, the word hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah looked out the window again at Bailey, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the legal storm gathering on the horizon. She thought about Emma, sweet, innocent Emma, and the conversation they'd need to have. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that her father's lawyers want to take away the being that helped her mother survive? When, Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Come alone. We need to discuss strategy, and we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here. After hanging up, Sarah sat in silence, watching the sunlight move across the kitchen floor. In approximately 36 hours, her life would never be the same. The question wasn't whether she could fight. She had to. The question was whether she had the strength. As she looked at Bailey through the window and thought about Emma returning from school in 90 minutes, Sarah understood something with crystal clarity. This wasn't just a legal battle for custody. This was a fight for survival, for her daughters, for the fragile recovery she'd fought so hard to build. The devastating accusation had arrived, and Sarah had to decide if she was brave enough to fight back. The first panic attack happened 3 weeks after Michael left. Sarah had been in the grocery store, standing in the cereal aisle, when the world suddenly started collapsing inward. Her vision narrowed to a pinpoint. Her heart raced so violently she thought it might explode through her ribs. Her hands tingled. Her throat closed. She abandoned her cart and ran to the parking lot, gasping for air like a drowning victim pulled from the ocean. A concerned store employee followed her outside, asking if she needed an ambulance. Sarah couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't do anything except sit on the curb and shake while strangers stared. That was just the beginning. What followed was 2 years of a suffering so profound that Sarah would later describe it as living underwater. Not drowning. Drowning is quick. This was worse. This was a slow suffocation, an aching compression of the soul that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. Getting out of bed felt like lifting a car. Showering required a motivational speech to herself. Looking in the mirror brought waves of self-loathing so intense she'd have to look away. The woman staring back at her wasn't anyone she recognized. Her eyes were hollow. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. The rejection from Michael, not just the divorce itself, but the casual cruelty of it, had shattered something fundamental in Sarah's psyche. She'd invested 15 years in building a life with him, and he'd simply decided that life didn't include her anymore. He decided she wasn't enough. The yoga instructor was younger, thinner, more flexible in every sense of the word. Michael had fallen out of love with Sarah the way one outgrows a childhood toy, suddenly, without warning and without looking back. Emma had been 3 years old when Michael moved out. Sarah remembered that day vividly, the little girl's confused face as Michael packed his belongings, his awkward attempts to explain that Daddy was going to live somewhere else now, but he'd see her every other weekend. Emma had cried. Michael had promised they'd do fun things together. Then he'd kissed their daughter's forehead, given Sarah a check for child support, and left, just like that. The apartment felt hollow afterward, like a stage set after the show ends. For months, Sarah had tried to hold it together for Emma's sake. She'd wake up, make breakfast, take Emma to preschool, go through the motions of functioning. But the moment Emma left for school, Sarah would collapse. She'd return home and literally crawl back into bed, pulling the covers over her head like a child hiding from monsters. Except the monsters were inside her, a chorus of cruel voices telling her she was worthless, that Emma deserved better, that everyone would be better off without her. The psychiatrist prescribed a standard SSRI for depression and anxiety. Sarah took it faithfully, waiting for the magical transformation she'd heard about in pharmaceutical commercials. Happy people riding bikes, laughing with friends, living full lives. The medication didn't work like that. Instead, it simply created a layer of numbness between Sarah and her emotions. She wasn't depressed anymore, she was just absent. She'd sit across from Emma at dinner and feel like an actress performing the role of mother, rather than actually being one. Emma would talk about her day, and Sarah would nod mechanically while thinking about nothing and everything simultaneously. The therapy didn't help much either. Doctor was well-meaning and clinically competent, but every session felt like trying to describe color to someone who'd been blind their entire life. How do you explain the weight of depression to someone who'd never experienced it? How do you make someone understand that your brain is literally broken in ways that willpower and positive thinking cannot fix? Sarah's work suffered dramatically. She was a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized tech company, and her job had always required creativity and enthusiasm. But showing up to meetings, smiling at colleagues, pretending everything was fine became an impossible performance. She made mistakes. She missed deadlines. She sat through presentations unable to focus, her mind drifting to dark places. Eventually, her manager called her into his office. His expression was sympathetic but firm. The company was going in a different direction with their marketing department, and they'd be exploring other options. It was a polite firing. Losing her job accelerated Sarah's decline. She stopped showering regularly. She stopped changing her clothes. She stopped pretending. Some days she didn't leave the apartment except to pick Emma up from school. Emma began asking questions. "Mommy, why are you sad all the time? Mommy, why don't you want to play? Mommy, do you still love me?" That last question, whispered by her 5-year-old daughter, broke something in Sarah. She held Emma and sobbed, terrified of what kind of mother she was. A mother who couldn't get out of bed. A mother whose grief was so consuming it had become her daughter's burden. A mother who sometimes, and this was the part that truly terrified her, wondered if Emma would be better off with Michael, with his new girlfriend, with anyone who could actually function. One particularly dark night, sitting alone after Emma fell asleep, Sarah had gone to the bathroom medicine cabinet. She'd pulled out the bottle of and stared at it for a long time. It would be so easy, so final. No more pain, no more feeling like a failure, no more being a burden to everyone. She'd held the bottle in one hand and a framed photograph of Emma in the other, and she genuinely contemplated which was more important, her pain or her daughter's need. It was that moment, standing on the edge of the abyss, that forced Sarah to make a choice. Not because she suddenly felt better, not because some miraculous inspiration struck, but because even through the suffocating depression, even through the fog of despair, she understood one fundamental truth. Emma needed her. Not a perfect version of her mother, just her. Alive, present, trying. That's when Sarah had volunteered at the animal shelter. A desperate grasp for anything, any distraction, any reason to leave the apartment and engage with the world. She'd expected nothing. She'd prepared for more disappointment. She'd never expected Bailey. The courtroom smelled like old wood and desperation. Sarah sat at the defendant's table in a navy blazer she'd purchased specifically for this day, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Beside her, James flipped through his notes with an expression of calm confidence that Sarah deeply. Across the aisle, Michael sat with his attorney, Robert Mitchell, a man with a silver tongue and the moral compass of a rattlesnake, and his new girlfriend, who looked bored, as if she had somewhere more important to be. The opposing counsel was methodical and brutal in a way that only the truly skilled can be. Robert Mitchell stood before the court and painted a picture of Sarah that was technically accurate in details but devastatingly misleading in context. He spoke about her documented mental health struggles, her extended unemployment, her excessive dependence on pharmaceutical intervention, and most damaging of all, her inappropriate reliance on an animal for emotional regulation. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, his voice oozing sympathy like venom, "we are not here to judge Ms. Mitchell for her struggles. Mental illness is, after all, a medical condition. However, the paramount concern of this court must be the welfare of the minor child. A parent dealing with severe depression and anxiety, a parent who admits she cannot function without medication and animal companionship, is a parent operating at a significant disadvantage." Sarah felt her face burning. The way he'd framed her recovery, her hard-won, painfully earned recovery, made it sound like weakness, like she was unstable, dangerous. Then they brought in the expert witness. Dr. Hayes was exactly the type of man Sarah instinctively distrusted. He was immaculately dressed in a three-piece suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His hair was slicked back with product that caught the courtroom lights. His smile was practiced and cold. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone absolutely convinced of his own importance. As he was sworn in, Sarah noticed he didn't actually look at her. He looked through her, as if she were beneath his notice. Mitchell guided him through his testimony with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Hayes had impressive credentials, a doctorate from a prestigious university, 30 years of experience as a behavioral specialist, numerous publications. Mitchell made sure every credential was mentioned multiple times, establishing Hayes as an unquestionable authority. "Dr. Hayes," Mitchell began, "in your professional opinion, how common is it for rescue dogs to have behavioral issues?" Hayes leaned back in his chair, adopting an expression of grave concern. "Extremely common. When we rescue dogs from situations of abuse, neglect, or hoarding, as was the case with the dog in question, we're often dealing with animals whose psychological programming has been fundamentally altered. They can be unpredictable, reactive, and dangerous. Dangerous, Mitchell repeated as if shocked. Can you elaborate? Absolutely. A dog with trauma history can exhibit sudden aggression. They might respond to normal stimuli, a child's cry, quick movements, loud noises, with violence. The dog's past has essentially primed it for aggressive responses. And crucially, owners with mental health issues often lack the emotional stability necessary to properly manage a potentially dangerous animal. They may miss warning signs or fail to implement appropriate boundaries. Sarah wanted to scream. Bailey had never shown aggression. Never. But she sat frozen, watching this man systematically dismantle her life with words that sounded authoritative but felt like lies. Hayes continued, describing case studies of dog attacks, statistics about rescue animal incidents, theories about rescue dog psychology that seemed pulled from thin air. He spoke about Sarah's documented PTSD and anxiety as if they were terminal illnesses. A mother in Ms. Mitchell's condition, he stated with absolute certainty, is not in a position to properly supervise a potentially dangerous animal around a young child. The risks are simply too great. Mitchell showed Hayes photographs of Bailey. Harmless photographs of the dog playing, resting, interacting gently with Emma. But the way Mitchell presented them made them seem sinister. Dr. Hayes, based on these images and the dog's history, would you recommend this animal be in a home with a 5-year-old child? No, Hayes said without hesitation. I would not. The liability is too great. The risk of injury to the child is unacceptable. Sarah's attorney stood for cross-examination, but his efforts felt like throwing pebbles at a fortress. He questioned Hayes about Bailey specifically. Had he ever evaluated this particular dog? No. Did he have any evidence of aggressive behavior? No. Was he aware that numerous studies supported the therapeutic benefits of animals for people with PTSD? Hayes waved away the studies as not applicable to this specific situation and conducted by researchers with obvious biases. What made it worse was that Hayes was skilled at this. He anticipated every challenge. He had an answer for everything. When James presented research, Hayes dismissed it. When James pointed out that Hayes had never met Sarah or Bailey, Hayes said his professional opinion was based on categories and probabilities, not individual cases. He spoke with such confidence that Sarah began to doubt herself. Was Bailey dangerous? Was she unstable? Was she the kind of mother Michael's team was describing? Then Mitchell brought it home. Ms. Mitchell has admitted to relying on this animal for emotional support, correct? She stated that the dog helps her manage her anxiety and depression. Yes, Hayes confirmed. So this dog is essentially functioning as a psychiatric medication, an emotional crutch that Ms. Mitchell depends on. In a very real sense, yes. And that's problematic because it places the responsibility for an adult's mental health on a dependent being. It's an unhealthy dynamic. It sets a poor example for a child, and it means that Ms. Mitchell's emotional stability is contingent on the presence of an animal, which is inherently unstable. The way Hayes said it made Sarah feel sick. Yes, she depended on Bailey, but not because she was weak, because Bailey had literally saved her life. The dog wasn't a crutch, she was a bridge to recovery. And the idea that her love for Bailey, her gratitude toward the being who'd pulled her back from the brink of suicide, was somehow pathological felt like a fundamental violation. By the time Hayes finished his testimony, the portrait was complete. Sarah was an unstable woman with a history of mental illness who had become irrationally attached to a potentially dangerous animal, and who was therefore an unsuitable guardian for an innocent child. Michael, by contrast, was stable, employed in a new relationship, and clearly the better option. That evening, locked in the bathroom of her apartment, Sarah sobbed until she couldn't breathe. Bailey pawed at the door, whimpering, confused by her distress. Emma asked through the door if Mommy was okay. Sarah couldn't even answer. She was drowning again, pulled under by the same dark waters she'd fought so hard to escape. And the worst part was knowing that tomorrow she'd have to go back into that courtroom and somehow prove that the narrative they'd constructed was a lie. She wasn't sure she had the strength. Emma didn't understand why Mommy was so nervous. Over the past 2 weeks, Sarah had spent countless hours preparing her daughter for this moment, explaining in age-appropriate language what would happen in the courtroom. You're going to sit in a special chair and answer questions about our home, Sarah had said gently. About Bailey, about how we live together. You just need to tell the truth, okay? Tell the truth about what you see and what you feel. But preparing a 5-year-old for testimony was like trying to teach a goldfish to read. Emma understood fragments. She understood that this was important. She understood that Daddy's lawyer would ask her questions. but she couldn't possibly comprehend the weight of what this moment meant, that her words could determine whether she'd continue living with her mother and Bailey, or whether everything would be torn apart. The morning of Emma's testimony, Sarah had woken before dawn, unable to sleep. She'd laid in bed listening to Bailey's gentle snoring, her mind churning through every possible scenario. What if Emma froze on the stand? What if she became confused? What if she said something that sounded innocent but could be twisted into something damaging? The anxiety was suffocating. Sarah had taken an extra dose of her anxiety medication, something she rarely did just to function. She dressed Emma in the white sundress with tiny pink flowers that they'd purchased together at the mall. Emma had been excited about the dress then, spinning in front of the mirror, feeling special. Now, as Sarah buttoned the dress that morning, Emma sensed her mother's tension and became unusually quiet. "Mommy, will Daddy be there?" Emma asked. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice level. "But that's okay, you just focus on telling the truth." "Will Daddy be mad at me?" Sarah's heart broke. She pulled Emma close, burying her face in her daughter's soft hair. "No, baby, this isn't about being mad. Daddy loves you, I love you, this is just. The adults need to figure some things out, okay? And we need your help to tell them the truth about our life." "About Bailey?" Emma asked. "About Bailey, about me, about everything." In the courtroom, Sarah watched James guide Emma to the witness stand. Her daughter looked impossibly small climbing into the chair, her little feet dangling without touching the ground. The bailiff had to place a cushion behind her so she could see over the edge of the box. A microphone was adjusted downward. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. Judge leaned forward, her expression warm and intentional. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair, and Sarah had begun to wonder if that kindness masked a judicial bias. "Emma," the judge said softly, "my name is Judge. You're doing something very brave today by coming to talk to us. Before we start, I need to ask you something important. Do you understand that you need to tell us the truth? Even if you're scared or confused, we need you to tell us what's real." Emma nodded solemnly. "Like when I tell Mommy I didn't eat the cookies, but I really did?" she asked. Several people in the courtroom suppressed smiles. Even Judge's lips twitched slightly. "Yes, exactly like that, except today we need you to tell the truth about everything. Can you do that?" "Yes," Emma said, sitting up. James began his questioning gently. "Emma, can you tell us about your home? What's it like?" Emma was hesitant at first, her words coming slowly. She described the apartment, the kitchen where Mommy made dinosaur sandwiches, the living room with the big couch where they watched movies, her bedroom with the purple walls. She talked about her daily routine. Breakfast, preschool, coming home to Bailey, playing in the yard. "Tell us about Bailey," James prompted. "What's Bailey like?" Emma's face brightened. This was a subject she knew well. "Bailey is my best friend. She sleeps with me at night. She's soft and warm. She knows when I'm sad and she comes and lays her head on my lap. When Daddy left, I cried a lot and Bailey would come sleep with me." Emma's voice became more animated. "And she knows when I'm sick. One time I had a fever and Bailey wouldn't leave my room. She kept licking my face to wake Mommy up. And Mommy checked my temperature and I had a fever. Bailey saved me." "How did Bailey save you?" James asked gently. "She told Mommy I was sick," Emma explained with the absolute certainty only a child could possess. "If Bailey hadn't done that, maybe I would have gotten sicker." Sarah felt tears beginning to form. This was the truth. Not the clinical, distorted version that Dr. Hayes had presented, but the actual lived experience of a child who'd watched this dog care for her. "Have you ever been afraid of Bailey?" James asked. "Has Bailey ever done anything that scared you or hurt you?" "No," Emma said firmly. "Bailey is gentle. She lets me hug her and pull her tail and climb on her. She's my friend." It was during the cross-examination that everything shifted. Robert Mitchell stood with the calculated confidence of a predator. Sarah felt her stomach clench. He'd been professional with Emma up until now, but she knew this was where the real attack would come. "Emma," he began, "you said your mommy cries a lot, is that right?" Emma nodded. "She cried a lot when Daddy left." "And does it scare you when Mommy cries?" "Sometimes," Emma admitted, "but Bailey helps. Bailey makes her better." "So Bailey is more important to your mommy than you are?" Mitchell asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Sarah wanted to object, but James placed a hand on her arm, signaling her to stay quiet. This was the strategy. Let Emma speak for herself. Emma's face scrunched in concentration. "No," she said slowly. Bailey helps Mommy so Mommy can be better for me. When Mommy had Bailey, she got up and took me to the park. She made me breakfast." She smiled more. "So Bailey made your Mommy happy?" Mitchell tried a different angle. "Bailey helped Mommy," Emma corrected, using the exact phrasing Sarah had used. "Mommy helped Bailey too. They helped each other." Then came the question that would change everything. "Emma, doesn't the dog ever frighten you? Don't you worry that she might hurt you?" Mitchell asked, his tone suggesting that surely a reasonable child would agree. The courtroom fell into attentive silence. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Would this child confirm Dr. Hayes' testimony about the dangerous animal? Emma straightened in her chair. Her small hands gripped the edges of the witness box. And then, with a clarity and certainty that seemed impossible for a 5-year-old, she looked directly at the judge. "No," Emma said firmly. "Bailey didn't hurt me. Bailey saved Mommy. Mommy was very sad and cried a lot. She couldn't get up. Bailey made her happy again. Mommy is a good mom because Bailey helped her be strong." The courtroom went absolutely silent. Not a breath, not a movement. Even the court stenographer seemed momentarily frozen. Emma continued, emboldened by her own courage. "Mommy loves me and Bailey loves me. That's my family. I don't want to leave them." Sarah felt something shift in the courtroom, a fundamental change in the atmosphere. The judge's expression had transformed. Even Michael looked uncomfortable, unable to maintain eye contact. Robert Mitchell stood frozen, his predatory confidence momentarily shaken. Emma had spoken the truth that no expert testimony could contradict. The truth of a child's lived experience, the visceral reality of love and recovery witnessed through innocent eyes. The courtroom had been transformed by 5-year-old wisdom. The silence that followed Emma's testimony seemed to stretch into infinity. Not a single person moved. Not a breath was drawn. The court stenographer's fingers remained suspended above her keyboard, as if the words Emma had spoken were too sacred to immediately transcribe into the mechanical record. Sarah felt like she was floating outside her body, watching the scene unfold from some distant vantage point. Her daughter, her beautiful, innocent daughter, had just articulated something that no expert witness, no legal argument, no carefully prepared testimony could replicate. The raw, unfiltered truth of a child's experience. Judge, a woman who had presided over hundreds of custody cases, slowly set down her pen. Her expression was difficult to read, but something had shifted behind her eyes. Sarah had watched enough courtroom dramas to recognize the look of someone whose perspective had fundamentally changed in the span of a single moment. Robert Mitchell remained standing, his mouth slightly open. The silver-tongued attorney who had systematically demolished Sarah's character, who had painted her as an unstable liability, who had presented expert testimony about dangerous animals and irresponsible parenting. He looked genuinely off balance. His prepared follow-up questions seemed to have evaporated from his mind. Do you have further questions, counselor?" Judge asked, her voice carrying a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. Mitchell opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Yes, Your Honor. Emma, you said your mother is a good mom, but isn't it true that she sometimes stays in bed, that she doesn't always get up to take care of you?" It was a desperate attempt to recover, to plant doubt, but Emma's answer was damning in its simplicity and honesty. "Sometimes Mommy is tired," Emma said, her voice matter-of-fact in the way only children could be. "But she always takes care of me. She makes sure I eat. She makes sure I go to school. She tucks me in at night. And when she's very sad, Bailey stays with her and then Mommy gets better. Bailey is like a helper, like a nurse." Where did a 5-year-old get the word, nurse? Sarah realized Emma must have overheard her talking to someone, probably at the therapist's office. Her daughter had absorbed more of Sarah's journey than Sarah had realized. I have no further questions," Mitchell said, retreating to his seat. He avoided looking at Sarah or James, his usual confidence visibly shaken. James stood. "Your Honor, I have no further questions for Emma, but I'd like to request that Emma be allowed to step down now. This has been difficult for such a young child." Judge nodded. "Of course. Emma, you've done a wonderful job today. You told the truth and that took courage. You can step down now and go sit with your mother." Emma climbed down from the witness stand carefully, her small face flushed with the exertion of being the center of attention. She practically ran to Sarah, who scooped her into her arms. Sarah held her daughter against her chest, feeling Emma's small heart beating against hers, and she allowed herself to cry, not the tears of despair that had characterized the past 2 years, but tears of gratitude and profound relief. "Did I do good, Mommy?" Emma whispered. "You did perfect, baby," Sarah breathed into her hair. "You were so brave." What Sarah didn't fully comprehend in that moment was the magnitude of what had just happened. Emma hadn't just defended her mother and her dog. She had shattered the narrative that the opposing counsel had so meticulously constructed. She had demonstrated, through the innocence and clarity of childhood testimony, what all the expert opinions and legal arguments had failed to convey: the actual lived reality of life in Sarah's home. As Emma settled into a chair beside her, still basking in the praise, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening around the courtroom. 2 women in the gallery were crying. A young man who Sarah didn't recognize, perhaps a law student or journalist, was furiously taking notes. Even the bailiff looked moved, his usual stoic expression softened. Judge called for a brief recess. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes, she announced. "Counselors, I'll expect closing arguments then." As the courtroom cleared, Michael approached their table. Sarah tensed, ready for an attack or some cutting remark. Instead, Michael knelt down to Emma's level. "Hey, Princess, you did good up there." Emma looked at him uncertainly. "I told the truth about Mommy and Bailey." "I know," Michael said, and Sarah saw something genuine flicker across his face. Perhaps guilt, perhaps just the discomfort of a man confronting the consequences of his actions. He stood and walked away without another word, trailing behind him, both of them looking distinctly uncomfortable. During the recess, James pulled Sarah aside into a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway. His usual professional demeanor had cracked slightly, revealing genuine emotion beneath. "Sarah, what your daughter just did in there, that was extraordinary. That was the kind of testimony that changes cases. That testimony, coming from an articulate, honest, uncoached 5-year-old, is worth more than a dozen expert witnesses. She wasn't trying to help you. She was just telling the truth about her life, and that truth is devastating to their case." "Do you think?" Sarah couldn't even finish the question, afraid to hope. "I think," James said carefully, "that we have a real chance now. A genuine chance. That testimony reframed everything. Instead of a narrative about an unstable mother with a dangerous dog, the judge now has a narrative about a resilient child living in a loving home with a supportive animal. And the witness delivering that narrative was the most credible witness possible, the child herself." Sarah felt something that had been locked away for months begin to unfurl in her chest. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope of someone grasping at straws, but genuine, substantive hope grounded in the reality of what had just transpired. As they waited to return to the courtroom, Sarah watched Emma coloring quietly in a corner, unburdened by the weight of what she'd accomplished. Emma didn't understand the legal complexities or the strategic importance of her testimony. She'd simply done what she'd been asked to do: tell the truth about her life, her mother, and her dog. When they returned to the courtroom, Sarah noticed the judge's demeanor had shifted subtly. She seemed more present, more engaged, less neutral. The usual facade of judicial distance had been penetrated by the simple honesty of a child's words. Robert Mitchell's closing arguments, when they came, felt hollow and desperate. He repeated statistics about rescue dogs and mental illness, but his arguments seemed to bounce off the courtroom walls without landing. The damage had been done. Dr. Hayes's testimony, which had seemed so authoritative and damaging just hours earlier, now felt like it belonged to a different case entirely. A case about abstract risks and theoretical dangers rather than the actual lived reality that Judge had just witnessed. Sarah's attorney delivered his closing arguments with renewed confidence, barely referencing the legal complexities that had seemed so important before Emma. Instead, he simply reminded the judge of one fundamental truth. "Your Honor, you've heard from every relevant witness today, but the most important testimony came from Emma. She lives in that home. She knows that mother and that dog, and she has told us with the clarity that only truth possesses what that life is actually like." As they waited for Judge to deliberate, Sarah held Emma's hand and Bailey's leash, wondering if this day, this single extraordinary day, might actually be the turning point that saved her family. Dr. Rachel was everything Dr. Hayes was not. Where Hayes had been polished and distant, was warm and approachable. Where Hayes had presented theoretical abstractions, spoke with the grounded authority of someone who had spent 3 decades actually working with children and families. She entered the courtroom wearing a charcoal gray suit and carried a leather portfolio filled with peer-reviewed research and clinical case studies. James guided her through her credentials with methodical precision, held a D in developmental psychology from university. She had published over 40 peer-reviewed articles on child attachment, trauma recovery, and the therapeutic benefits of human-animal bonds. She had as an expert witness in over 30 custody cases. She had founded and directed the Institute for Child Resilience at a major medical center. She consulted with school districts and therapeutic organizations across the country. Her curriculum alone took 5 minutes to recite. But it was her manner of speaking that truly set her apart from Dr. Hayes. When James asked her to explain her expertise in simple terms, smiled warmly at the judge. "Your Honor, my field is understanding how children develop secure attachments and how those attachments support healthy psychological development. I'm particularly interested in how therapeutic animals facilitate healing in children who experience trauma or loss." "And have you had an opportunity to review this case?" James asked. "I have. I've reviewed the court documents, the testimony that was provided this morning, and I've spoken extensively with Ms. Mitchell about her circumstances and her daughter's development. Dr. Hayes earlier that rescue dogs with trauma histories are inherently unpredictable and pose significant risks to children. What's your professional response to that assertion?" Doctor paused thoughtfully, choosing her words carefully. "I respectfully disagree with Dr. Hayes's characterization, both generally and specifically as it applies to this case. Research in my field consistently demonstrates that rescue animals, including dogs with trauma histories, can actually provide significant psychological benefits when placed in appropriate homes with stable caregivers. In fact, there's growing evidence that shared trauma can actually strengthen the bond between human and animal. They understand each other in ways that animals without trauma histories may not." "Can you explain that?" James prompted. "Certainly, when a traumatized person adopts a traumatized animal, something remarkable often happens. The animal senses the human's emotional state with unusual accuracy. The human, in turn, develops deep compassion and understanding for the animal. They heal together. This is particularly powerful in cases where the human has experienced significant mental health challenges. The animal becomes a mirror and a mirror-bearer simultaneously." Sarah watched the judge lean forward slightly, her full attention on Dr. Now, Dr. Hayes suggested that Ms. Mitchell's reliance on this dog for emotional regulation indicates unhealthy dependence. How do you respond to that characterization? His expression became more serious. "I have to push back quite strongly on that framing. What Dr. Hayes is describing isn't dependency in a pathological sense, it's therapeutic partnership. When we treat anxiety and depression, we use multiple modalities: medication, therapy, lifestyle changes, social support. An emotional support animal is simply another evidence-based intervention. In fact, the American Psychological Association recognizes human-animal interaction as a legitimate therapeutic tool." "But isn't there a risk," Mitchell interjected, standing for cross-examination, "that Ms. Mitchell has substituted the animal for actual treatment? That she's using the dog as a band-aid instead of addressing her underlying mental health issues?" Met his challenge directly. "That would be a concern if that were what was happening, but it isn't. Ms. Mitchell is currently in therapy, takes medication for her anxiety and depression, and has built a functional life. The dog isn't a substitute for treatment, it's a complement to treatment. It's part of a comprehensive approach to recovery, and frankly, it's been extraordinarily effective. She hasn't had a psychiatric hospitalization. She's maintaining employment. She's actively parenting her child. Those are markers of success." "But surely," Mitchell pressed, "you'd agree that if the dog were removed, Ms. Mitchell's mental health would deteriorate." "It might," acknowledged, "just as it would if we removed her medication or discontinued her therapy. But that's not an argument for removing the dog. That's an argument for recognizing how essential it is to her and her ability to parent effectively." James then introduced his most powerful testimony, her analysis of Emma's testimony from a developmental psychology perspective. "Doctor, you observed young Emma's testimony this morning. Can you provide the court with your professional assessment?" Adjusted her glasses thoughtfully. "What I observed was a child demonstrating remarkable emotional intelligence and secure attachment. Emma accurately described her mother's emotional state, depression, sadness. She understood causation. When Bailey was present, her mother improved. She articulated complex ideas in age-appropriate language. Most importantly, she demonstrated security and trust." A child who was living in an unsafe environment would show signs of anxiety, evasiveness, or fear during testimony. Emma showed none of those things. "Can you explain the significance of that?" James asked. "Absolutely. Children are remarkably honest about their environment. If Emma were being harmed or endangered, she would show behavioral indicators. She might be anxious, withdrawn, or clingy. She might display aggression or regression. The fact that Emma is articulate, confident, and emotionally secure is strong evidence that she's living in a safe, nurturing home." James presented research studies one by one, walked the court through peer-reviewed literature showing the measurable benefits of emotional support animals for people with PTSD and anxiety disorders. She presented data demonstrating that children raised with dogs show increased empathy, better emotional regulation, and more secure attachment styles. She cited studies showing that rescue animals pose no greater risk of injury than non-rescue animals. Then James asked the crucial question, "Doctor, in your professional opinion, what would be the psychological impact on Emma if she were separated from both her mother and Bailey?" His expression became very serious. "That would be developmentally harmful. Emma has formed secure attachments to both her mother and the animal. They constitute her primary support system. Severing that attachment, particularly through a custody change, would likely result in anxiety, attachment disorder, behavioral problems, and potentially long-term psychological consequences. The child has been through the trauma of parental divorce. She's now stable. To disrupt that stability would be contraindicated from a mental health perspective." "No further questions," James said, clearly satisfied with testimony. Mitchell's cross-examination was less aggressive than it had been with previous witnesses. He seemed to recognize that was too credentialed, too articulate, and too well-prepared to be easily rattled. "Doctor, you haven't physically examined this dog, correct? You're basing your opinions on what Ms. Mitchell has told you." "That's true," acknowledged. "However, I have observed the dog in person during my sessions with Ms. Mitchell. The animal's behavior is consistent with what she's reported. Gentle, responsive, attuned to emotional states." "But couldn't someone with mental health issues misperceive a dog's behavior? Couldn't they interpret normal canine behavior as therapeutic when it's actually just dog behavior?" Smiled slightly. "Possibly, but that's why we look at outcomes. Ms. Mitchell's mental health has improved measurably. Emma is thriving. There are objective markers of that don't depend on anyone's interpretation. These facts speak for themselves." As stepped down from the stand, Sarah felt something shift fundamentally in the courtroom's atmosphere. Dr. Hayes's expert testimony, which had seemed so authoritative and damaging just hours earlier, now appeared to be what it actually was. One man's biased interpretation, contradicted by peer-reviewed research and clinical expertise. Judge was taking notes more actively than she had during Hayes's testimony. Her expression was thoughtful, engaged, clearly processing everything had said. That evening, James called Sarah with cautious optimism. "The tide has turned," he said simply. His testimony neutralized everything Hayes said. Now we just wait for the judge's decision. As Sarah held Bailey and watched Emma sleep, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they might actually survive this. 3 days of deliberation felt like 3 years. Sarah had barely slept, barely eaten. She'd called in sick to the part-time job she'd recently started at a local nonprofit, unable to concentrate on anything other than the waiting. Time moved with excruciating slowness. Each hour felt like a day. Each day felt like a month. She'd refresh her email obsessively, checking for any message from James's office. She'd walk Bailey compulsively through the neighborhood, burning off nervous energy. She'd hold Emma close at night, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "Mommy, will the judge say I can stay with you?" Emma asked on the morning of the decision. "I hope so, baby," Sarah said, unable to offer false certainty. The judge listened to everything. Now she's thinking about it very carefully. "Bailey's hopping too," Emma said, hugging the dog. "Bailey keeps looking sad." Sarah smiled despite her terror. Emma was right. Bailey seemed to sense the anxiety permeating the household. The dog stayed close to Sarah, rarely leaving her side, as if understanding that something significant hung in the balance. James called at 9:47 a.m. "The judge is ready to deliver her ruling. Be at the courthouse by 11 a.m. Bring Emma." The drive to the courthouse felt surreal. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Emma chattered nervously about everything except what mattered. Sarah found a parking spot and sat in the car for 5 minutes, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. The courtroom was full, more full than it had been for any previous hearing. James had mentioned that the case was drawing attention. Emma's testimony had apparently been discussed in legal circles and among mental health professionals. There were journalists in the gallery. There were law students observing. The air felt electrically charged. Michael and sat on the opposing side, both looking nervous. Robert Mitchell was reviewing documents one final time, but even he seemed subdued. Whatever confidence he'd possessed at the beginning of the trial had been gradually eroded by testimony and the emotional power of Emma's words. Judge entered with the gravity of someone about to deliver a decision that mattered. She took her seat and opened a thick folder containing her written judgment. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. "This case," the judge began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, "has required me to consider several critical questions. First and foremost, what constitutes a safe, stable, loving environment for a child? Second, how do we weigh expert testimony against lived experience? And third, what is the role of therapeutic animals in family dynamics?" Sarah felt Emma slip her hand into hers. "Over the course of these proceedings, I have heard testimony from multiple parties. I have reviewed psychological evaluations, medical records, and expert opinions. I have observed the behavior and demeanor of the primary witnesses, and I have made careful note of what I witnessed in this courtroom." The judge paused, looking over her glasses at the opposing counsel. "I must begin by addressing the testimony of Dr. Hayes. While Dr. Hayes is certainly qualified and experienced, I found his testimony to be characterized by significant bias and overgeneralization. Dr. Hayes presented theories and statistics as if they were facts applicable to this specific case. He did not personally evaluate the dog in question. He did not observe the household. He did not meet Ms. Mitchell or her daughter. Yet he presented sweeping conclusions about danger and risk. This I found to be professionally irresponsible." Sarah felt a small surge of hope kindle in her chest. In contrast, Dr. Rachel provided testimony grounded in peer-reviewed research, clinical experience, and careful observation. Doctor demonstrated that emotional support animals are recognized therapeutic interventions. She demonstrated that Ms. Mitchell's recovery is measurable and real. She demonstrated that Emma is thriving, not in spite of the animal's presence, but partly because of it. Judge set down the report and looked directly at Sarah. "However," she continued, "the most significant testimony in this case did not come from any of the credentialed experts. It came from a 5-year-old child." The judge's eyes moved to Emma, who suddenly looked very small in her seat. Emma's testimony was remarkable. It was articulate. It was honest. It was emotionally sophisticated in ways that suggested a child living in genuine security and stability. When I ask myself the question, is this child safe, the answer is definitively yes. This child is loved. This child is secure. This child understands her mother's struggles with compassion and wisdom that would be remarkable in a child twice her age. Sarah felt tears beginning to form. "I have reviewed the documentation regarding Ms. Mitchell's mental health history. Yes, she has experienced significant depression and anxiety. Yes, she has required treatment and support. But I have also reviewed her progress. She is employed. She is engaged in therapy. She manages her mental health responsibly. And most importantly, she is an engaged, loving mother. The presence of the therapeutic animal in her life does not diminish her capacity for parenthood. It enhances it. It provides her with stability that allows her to be present for her daughter." Judge turned her attention to Michael's side of the courtroom. "I must also address something that concerns me deeply about these proceedings. There appears to have been an attempt to weaponize Ms. Mitchell's mental health struggles and her therapeutic relationship with her dog in order to gain custody advantage. This is troubling. This represents a misuse of the court system. Parents who struggle with mental health are not automatically inferior parents. In fact, many parents with lived experience of mental illness develop exceptional empathy and parenting skills precisely because they understand what it means to struggle." Robert Mitchell had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Therefore," Judge said, "I am issuing the following ruling. Custody of Emma Mitchell shall remain with her mother, Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell shall retain full custody with no restrictions. Furthermore, I am recognizing Bailey, the family dog, as an integral and valued member of the household. Any future modification of custody arrangements must account for the child's attachment to both her mother and the animal." Sarah couldn't breathe. For a moment, she simply sat frozen, unable to process that the decision had gone her way. Additionally, the judge continued, I am issuing a stern warning to the plaintiff's counsel regarding the use of mental health stigma as a custody weapon. This approach is ethically questionable and does not serve the interests of justice. I strongly encourage counsel to reflect on the implications of this approach for future cases. She looked directly at Robert Mitchell. The court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and the moment froze in time. Sarah grabbed Emma and pulled her into an embrace so tight she was afraid she might be hurting her, but Emma didn't object. She clung to her mother with equal intensity. We won? Emma asked, confusion and hope mingling in her voice. We won, baby, we won. James was beaming, shaking Sarah's hand vigorously. I told you, he said. I told you we had a chance. That was extraordinary. As they stood up to leave, Sarah saw Michael approach. He looked diminished somehow, like a man confronting the consequences of his actions for the first time. I'm sorry, he said quietly. It wasn't much, nowhere near enough to undo the pain and fear of the past months, but it was something. Sarah simply nodded. She had no energy for anger or recrimination. She just wanted to get home to Bailey, to hold her family together, to breathe the air of a woman who had survived. Walking out of the courthouse into the afternoon sunlight, Sarah felt reborn. The darkness that had nearly consumed her 2 years ago, the legal nightmare that had threatened everything she'd fought to build, it was over. They'd made it through. Emma skipped beside her, already chattering about what she wanted for dinner. Sarah smiled through her tears, knowing that for the first time in a long time, the future actually looked bright. 6 months had passed since the judge's gavel came down, and Sarah barely recognized the woman looking back at her from the bathroom mirror. The darkness that had once lived behind her eyes had retreated to something manageable, something she could acknowledge without being consumed by it. She was 34 years old, employed full-time at a nonprofit that focused on mental health advocacy, actively engaged in therapy, and most importantly, she was present, genuinely present in her life. The apartment felt different now, too. Gone was the heavy weight of impending doom. In its place was something lighter, hope perhaps, or at least the possibility of hope. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator. Bailey's toys were scattered across the living room floor. The walls held photographs of the three of them together, at the park, at the beach, on Emma's 6th birthday, a visual documentation of survival and recovery. This particular evening, Sarah sat in a church basement in downtown Portland, looking out at approximately 30 women ranging from their 20s to their 60s. Some looked hopeful. Others looked broken, the way Sarah had looked just 18 months ago. She recognized that particular shade of despair because she'd worn it like a second skin. Welcome to the Resilience Circle, Sarah began, her voice steady and warm. My name is Sarah, and I'm a single mother who struggled with severe depression and PTSD. I'm also someone whose recovery was profoundly helped by a rescue dog. This group exists because I believe our stories matter. I believe that struggling doesn't make you weak, and I believe that we heal together. She'd started this support group 3 months after the court decision. Her therapist had suggested it, a way to process her own trauma while helping others navigate theirs. Sarah had been terrified at first. Who was she to lead a support group? But then she'd remembered Judge's words about parents with mental illness developing exceptional empathy. Sarah's struggle had given her the ability to see suffering with uncommon clarity, and that was worth something. A woman named had raised her hand. Did your dog really change your life, or is that just what you tell yourself? Sarah smiled. She appreciated the skepticism. Both, she said honestly. Bailey didn't cure my depression. She didn't make my anxiety disappear. What she did was give me a reason to get up every morning. She forced routine into my life. She loved me when I couldn't love myself. And yes, she also provided measurable physiological benefits. When I'm anxious, petting her lowers my heart rate and blood pressure. That's not mystical. That's neuroscience. Another woman, sitting in the corner, spoke quietly. My ex-husband is trying to use my depression against me in custody court. He's hired expert witnesses to say I'm an unfit mother. Sarah's heart clenched. She recognized that fear. That's why we're telling these stories, she said gently. Because the narrative that mental illness equals bad parenting is a lie that courts sometimes believe, but a lie nonetheless. You deserve to have your experience witnessed and validated by people who understand. Over the next 2 hours, women shared stories of their own struggles. Stories of medication trials, hospitalization, medication combinations that finally worked, therapy breakthroughs, and slow, painful recovery. Stories of children who'd witnessed their mother's worst moments and loved them anyway. Stories of resilience that looked nothing like what society told them resilience should look like. By the end of the evening approached Sarah. "Thank you," she said simply. "I needed to hear that I'm not alone." "You're not," Sarah assured her. "Not even close." That same week, Sarah received an email from Judge. The judge had read her blog post, a detailed account of the custody battle and what it had meant to have her daughter's testimony be the turning point. Judge had been moved enough to cite the case in a legal journal article about mental health stigma in family law. The article was titled, "When Mental Illness Becomes a Weapon, How Courts Can Better Protect Families." Judge had written, "The case of Mitchell v. Mitchell presents a cautionary tale about the ways mental health can be weaponized in custody proceedings. However, it also presents a hopeful model for how testimony grounded in lived experience, particularly the testimony of a child, can counteract bias and expert testimony that lacks contextual accuracy. The presence of an emotional support animal should not be grounds for custody modification. Instead, it should be recognized as evidence of a parent actively managing their mental health and creating a stable environment for their child." Sarah had read the email multiple times, still unable to fully believe it. Her story, their story, was helping to change the legal landscape around mental health and parenting. Emma thrived in ways Sarah could barely have imagined during the darkest days. Her kindergarten teacher reported that Emma was empathetic, articulate, and emotionally intelligent. She had wonderful friendships. She showed no signs of trauma or anxiety disorder. When asked about her family, Emma described her household with unambiguous pride. "I live with my mom and Bailey, and we take care of each other." Bailey had become something of a local celebrity. The story of the courthouse dog who saved a family had been picked up by local news outlets and regional magazines. Sarah had been approached multiple times about writing a book, launching a podcast, creating a documentary. She declined most requests, but she had written 2 lengthy articles for mental health publications about the therapeutic power of rescue animals. What touched Sarah most were the messages she received from other women. Stories of mothers who'd been told they were unfit because of their mental illness, who found courage in Sarah's story to fight for their families. Stories of women who'd started therapy because reading about Sarah's recovery gave them hope that recovery was possible. Stories of rescue dogs changing lives in ways their adoptive families had never expected. One evening, watching Emma and Bailey play in the backyard while the sun set in shades of orange and purple, Sarah thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago. That woman had stood in a bathroom holding pills in one hand and a photograph in the other, genuinely uncertain which choice to make. That woman had believed her daughter would be better off without her. That woman had been wrong. "Mommy," Emma called from across the yard, "Bailey wants you to play tag." Sarah laughed and kicked off her shoes, running barefoot through the grass with Bailey bounding beside her and Emma shrieking with delight. They collapsed together in a heap on the lawn, 3 beings who had found each other through various forms of brokenness and discovered something unbreakable together. Later that night, after Emma was asleep and Bailey was snoring softly in her dog bed, Sarah sat down and wrote in her journal, something she did most evenings now. The practice had become as essential to her as medication or therapy. 6 months post-judgment, I'm still amazed we survived. More than survived, we're thriving. I'm not going to pretend recovery is linear. There are still hard days, days when the anxiety creeps back in, days when I feel that old weight threatening to return. But those days are manageable now. They're not my entire existence anymore. I think a lot about that moment in court when Emma, how her words cut through all the legal complexity and expert opinions and landed on simple truth. We love each other. We take care of each other. We're a family, nothing more complicated than that. I think about Judge and how her ruling created ripples I'm still discovering, how it's helping other women, how it's changing conversations about mental health and parenting. And I think about Bailey, how a rescue dog with her own trauma became the bridge that helped me cross from darkness to light, how we saved each other. 2 years ago, I couldn't imagine a future worth living. Now I can barely imagine how I survived without imagining the future as something to look forward to rather than something to escape. This is what recovery looks like, not perfect, not permanent, but real, and that's enough, more than enough, that's everything. Sarah closed her journal and looked out the window at the quiet street below. Somewhere out there, Other women were still struggling the way she had struggled. Other dogs were still waiting to be rescued. Other children were still witnessing their parents' battles with invisible illnesses. But here in this apartment, in this small circle of three beings bound together by love and survival and second chances, there was peace. There was home. There was proof that even in the darkest moments, light finds a way in. Bailey lifted her head, sensing Sarah's gaze, and Sarah smiled. She reached over and stroked the dog's soft fur, grateful beyond measure for this creature who had changed everything. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to the dog, to Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room, to Judge, to Doctor, to James, to everyone and everything that had contributed to this improbable, beautiful, hard-won recovery. Thank you for believing we were worth saving. And in the quiet darkness of the apartment, surrounded by the people and animals she loved, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to fully believe, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The end.